Well, good afternoon on this side of the Atlantic. Good morning on the other side. Welcome to this OECD webinar. I will give you some very brief information, technical information on how you will be able to ask questions during the webinar. And then we will start as normal with Natalie Klico. So, as you're looking at my screen at the moment, I'm able to see on the right Q&A panel, question and answers with a question mark. You click on that. At the bottom, you will see a box where you can type your questions. Type your questions, select all panelists, always send your questions to all panelists, and click on send. You can ask questions during the whole event, even if he's presenting. You can ask questions, and we will get questions together and show them during the question and answer session planned for around 4:25 Paris time. One point, I will just show this slide in case somebody can't hear us at the moment. This is what they have to do in order to listen to the webinar sound. Everybody else doesn't need to do anything. So that's it for my part. And to Natalie Klico.
Alexander, thank you. Welcome everybody. We are delighted to have you on this webinar from the OECD LEAD program. I just wanted to inform you we have 73 registered participants. We see that for the moment we are about 31, and we are coming from around 23 countries. So we're really delighted that you could take the time to come and discuss with us on this webinar on local economic resilience. Perhaps we just a few words to say this is the first webinar that we are organizing, so we are really happy afterwards to hear your views about how to improve it. One of the challenges is to not only to be able to meet in this virtual space, but mainly also to be able to have a participatory approach, because the point here is to hear from you and to also hear from our panelists that we've gathered today. So we hope this format can be a useful way of hearing. So without further ado, because we're also aware of the time, I would like to perhaps then give you a little more information about our project on understanding and on building resilience through greater adaptability to long-term challenges, and why we are undertaking this series of webinars. So probably I'll share my screen with you. Just a second. I'm Natalie Klico. I should have started this way. I'm a policy analyst at the LEAD program, and we're part of the Center for Entrepreneurship, SMEs, and Local Development at the OECD here. Our program on local economic development and employment program, we are actually been created in 1982, and we work on mainly very broad themes related to employment and skills, entrepreneurship, social economy, economic development, and we really look into questions leading to how we can contribute to creating more and better jobs at local level, and also promote innovation, build capacity, and see how all these strategies can be integrated at local level. We also have a forum on partnerships and local development, which you may have heard about because many of you are on this partnership list. And we also have a center in Trento, in Italy. I just wanted to start on to say that we are not the only one at the OECD working on resilience. There is a lot of work going on, and many people are actually using this term of resilience. But the inspiration comes mainly from last year's ministerial declaration at the OECD in 2014, which really focused on resilient economies and societies. So you can see here resilience has been defined as a broad concept centered on the ability not only to resist and recover from adverse shocks, but also bounce back stronger than before and learn from the experience. This is very important. You see that this strengthening resilience is explained and is seen as a very essential part of today's public policy making in view of the increasing policy complexity and interconnectedness. And we see that there are various complex problems, nearly wicked problems, demographic, technological trends, also environmental pressures. So all these events can have a negative impact on our economic growth and well-being. And this is why having this concept could be a useful way to better understand all these aspects and how they're connected together. I want to also to mention that there is currently a project also from the OECD Public Governance and Territorial Development Division and Directorate working on this resilience in cities, and I put the link there so you'll be able to have a look also. Here it's very interesting because our colleagues are trying to develop a framework for resilient cities looking at a broad range of aspects, not only economic but also institutional and other aspects of vulnerability. So I really invite you to have a look at this. But our own project on building resilience, what we were trying to do is really focus on, first of all, the local economic development questions and local labor markets, and also to try to understand what's the link between local resilience and the capacity to adapt to long-term challenges. And we've done a lot of work in the past on aging population or the transition to a green economy, so we also want to explore how this fits into this question. We want to examine this concept, and also we want to see what are the practical dimensions of this notion of local economic resilience, and why can it be interesting for local practitioners, and probably try to develop a framework that has this practical lens, because we really want to make this a useful tool probably we want to explore if it can be a useful tool for local partners and stakeholders, researchers, practitioners, and academics also. So we want really to understand from you and to give also an opportunity to use this concept in a practical way. So quickly, we are now started within our series, so this is the first webinar today. The series will continue until February 2016, and we will write a chapter on resilience in our forthcoming publication on job creation and local economic development. We hope in the course of next year also to carry out some local case studies and to have one policy paper on this aspect. So these are our practical deliverables for this project. I will come to the next step later, but I just want to remind all our panelists. So I did say that this is a work in progress, and so we are not here. We don't see our role today as presenting something already cooked and something already defined, but rather to hear from you and from our panelists what is the complexity of this concept of resilience, and this using this as a model also, perhaps thinking how we can also use these webinars tools to have this participatory approach with more views, because we are very pleased that we had participants from many countries. Here I just want to send a word of caution to native English speakers, and I think all our panelists are native English speakers, just to speak slowly, because not all of us speak English in our daily life, so this will make things easy for everybody. Well, without further ado, If that's fine, I don't want to take too long to introduce, but perhaps just let the floor to Professor Karen Chappell. Karen is a professor on city and regional planning at the University of California, Berkeley. And she has worked for many years on urban planning, I think, and she specialized in the relationship between local economic development and local workforces. She's also been active on a research network on building resilient regions. So we've asked Karen to give an overview of this concept of resilience, and then we'll give the floor to Professor Ron Martin, who's a professor of economic geography at the Department of Geography at the University of Cambridge, and also research has specialized on regional economic development and the relationships between geography, work, and public policy. And then we will have also the view from a partner, I think, with the participation from Neil McInroy from the Centre for Local Economic Strategies based in Manchester. And we will hear how they have used this notion of resilience in practice to better understand the relationship between commercial, public, and social economies at local level. So, with further ado, I will stop sharing my screen. Alors, here, stop sharing. Voilà. And I will give the floor to Karen Chappell.
Okay, good afternoon from California, where it is sun is just getting up. So my job here is to define some terms, provide some very basic concepts as a starting point for our discussion today and tomorrow. So I think this is kind of Resilience 101. And then I'll let the other panelists kind of complicate things. So as Natalie mentioned, my background is that I did spend a few years meeting with a bunch of academics in the Building Resilient Regions Network. And so what I'm going to do today is talk about the work and the thinking we all did together, share some of my work and my colleagues' work. So some basic definitions. At its simplest level, regional resilience is the ability to transform, of a region to transform itself in the face of challenge. Resilience has become quite a buzzword and is quite misused, and it's arguably become a rather fun concept. And so there's a lot of critique of it in the academic literature. At the same time, it clearly resonates for practitioners. For many people working in the field, resilience is actually what we do on a daily basis. So it can be a very useful term. So about four different fields that and their insights into resilience. In psychology, the insight is that resilience is an ordinary rather than an extraordinary way of being. So when people have a trauma, they have the capacity to bounce back over time. And resilience is all about capacities and behaviors and resources that one can develop over time to deal with difficult challenges. So the psychological insights are very important for us. In plant engineering, it's, again, basically this idea of bouncing back. So can a region recover if there's a disturbance? Has a region anticipated it well? Has it planned for it well? Does it have the assets or the governance to deal with it well, to resume its previous functions after the shock? In the idea of resilience becomes a little bit more complicated than in engineering and planning. It's really about whether you can absorb this disturbance and bounce back, but really shifting the structure or adapting the behavior. So you can think of this as shifting the new equilibrium, new normal, and adaptiveness in the face of a crisis. Regional economics field, and here I'd probably draw first from the work of Ron Martin, who's on the phone. Resilience is adaptive, essentially adaptive ability, how a region and its firms adapt to changes and shocks in competitive conditions, in market conditions, in technology, etc. These are shocks that are changing the trajectory of the regional economy. So this is essentially an adaptiveness notion in economics. So go to a table that was put together by some of my colleagues in the network, which I think kind of explains these different views quite nicely. You can see on the left side the nature of the challenge may differ. It may be a shock, or it may be what you think of as a slow burn. So if we think, instance, of a refugee crisis, right, we have a shock in recent months of tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of refugees arriving, versus a chronic slow burn, which would be this sort of trickling in over time of immigrants. So the nature of the challenge can differ, and then the response can differ. Again, we could go have a simple return to normal. So in the case of refugees, maybe we can absorb them into our economy. We can resume full employment quite after a short period of time. So the idea of establishing a new normal. So in the refugee example, this would be perhaps a restructuring of the economy so that refugees can be fruitfully employed. Maybe they'll be in new sectors. The economy will look a little different than it did before. The notion of adaptation. So this is thinking more about how is your system changing itself in order, in this case, to integrate refugees. We have the capacity in our education and training system to integrate refugees. Can we get them into the labor market? Can we adapt our systems in order to gradually integrate refugees? So these are three very different notions of what resilience might look like. So the talk about is the role of time, and this is tricky. Time is very deceptive, and you can see here, this again is from Catherine Foster's work. That so you have a moment that is before the shock. In the resilience case, you have the stress, and you recover to that original equilibrium. But in other cases, you might recover slowly, much more slowly. So it looks like you're not resilient, but actually it's simply taking longer. You could look like you're resilient, but you're actually relapsing in response to the shock. So we often have to look over the course of decades to really understand how resilient our economy is. And so this creates a lot of measurement challenges for those of us in the field that need to have outcomes right away. We're not going to know. And so in the refugee case, for instance, there are going to be places that are absorbing refugees into their labor market in rapid fashion, but in the long term they have problems. So there's many different outcomes that are possible over time. This slide, again, from Kate Foster's work, and a number of us have used this kind of simplified model in thinking about regional trajectories towards resilience or towards failure, that you have a starting state, sort of a pre-stress state, and then you have a post-stress state. You have certain regions you start below average and end below average. Those are the failing ones. But there are those that start below average that after the stress actually transform themselves into a new state, and those are the ones that we are particularly interested in understanding if we're interested in resilience, the ones that go from below average to above. And this, again, is simplified, and I'm going to complicate it in a second, thinking about some more measurement issues. About resilience, we need to think not just about outcomes, but also about governance. So we want to think about resilience in terms of assets and endowments, what our region has to draw from, but also the response to the crisis that mobilizes the assets. So how well positioned are the actors in institutions and culture, local culture, then to respond to this challenge. Okay, in terms of measurement issues, and this, I know you're going to talk a lot more about this, so this is going to be brief, but the many different things to think about when you're measuring resilience. And the first one is, of course, do you want to look at outcomes, where you end up? Do you want to look at the capacity, your adaptiveness? That's a very central debate, and it's much easier to measure outcomes typically than adaptiveness. So we tend to measure, for instance, how many of our refugees are employed, other than how well positioned our employment training system to integrate the refugees. Much harder to measure the latter. Then we also have measurement issues in terms of regional economic performance, and we all have our favorite indicators, and some are more effective than others, and they may not be capturing the regions in the way we think. So, for instance, we could measure employment or income of refugees, not be capturing, say, informal work or income coming from other types of, family members and so forth. So often when we measure regional economic performance, we're not actually measuring what we think we are. So it's very, very complicated. Governance, again, this is very challenging to measure networks and institutions and culture. How do we operationalize this? It's very, very important to understand how regions are organized and how systems are organized. And, for instance, if we're talking about refugees and how to integrate them into the economy, we're thinking about, not only what's the regional training system in place, but what are the informal family systems for training. And of the relative versus the absolute growth or change, and this is another debate that you can have endlessly. What's your basis for comparison? Do you want to, for instance, in a refugee case, do you want to see if you can achieve 5% unemployment, or do you want to look relative to your regional norm? So is full employment really relative to your regular employment rate, which might be 25% for youth in your region? So this is a factor to decide. And finally, the time frame is very important to think about. Do you want to measure from the very, very beginning, from when the first refugees came in, or do you really want to focus on the few months where you had a flood of refugees? And how you define your time frame is, of course, going to affect how resilient you look.
But Karen, that you already been through your 10 minutes, but
okay.
Please continue quickly.
We could skip this example. All I have was this example. We can skip this, and you can just read about it in my article. And let's go ahead to the rest of the discussion.
Oh, thank you, Karen. We'll just to make sure everybody will get everything. We will distribute all the presentations and also all the extra material that will be mentioned by all the panelists. So no worries there. You will get all these examples and everything. So thank you very much, Karen. I think it was a very clear introduction. You've plus already used this example of the refugee crisis, and thank you for explaining what this resilience framework is. Perhaps a fuzzy concept, but actually resonates very much for local practitioners, and that could have a use basically. And thank you also for warning us of the difficulty of measuring. Indeed, we will talk about this tomorrow. It's true that this notion of resilience can seem a little bit difficult to understand because it's very complex at the beginning, definitely something that we have to address. I have to give the floor to Ron Martin. He also worked a lot on this notion of resilience, and do you agree with this first presentation of Karen? And do you agree that this resilience notion can be sometimes a buzzword or fuzzy concept?
Well, first of all, can I say hello to everyone from a rather grey Cambridge. Secondly, I think people won't see me because my system doesn't work, so you hopefully can hear me, though you won't be able to see me. And I hope, Natalie, that people can see one or two slides and diagrams that I might have sent through.
Yes, so, I will share my screen and put the diagrams. Which one do you want to have?
There's one on regional economic resilience as process, which might be useful.
Then I will start sharing my screen and show this precise one. Okay. So as a process.
Okay, thank you. Well, first of all, can I say I think Karen introduced the subject extremely well, and there's a lot what she said which I would most warmly agree with. I guess my role is to try and just raise some problems and potential difficulties in a concept which I agree is extremely suggestive of how we look at local economic development, and even more so, I guess, in terms of policies wanting to rate or protect their local areas from and disturbances. So I agree, it's extremely attractive as a policy concept. I guess slightly problematize the issue in a way. First of all, I think, as Kent mentioned, the concept originated really back in the 60s and 70s in psychology, and particularly child psychology, and ecology and engineering. And since then, it's moved into all sorts of disciplines, from planning to organizational management studies, environmental, and of course to regional economics and so on. But the problem is, with any such concept that travels across disciplines, the concept is not thought about sufficiently when it's applied in one context from other. So you get conceptual stretching, if you like, and we need to be aware of that. First point really is that what we haven't yet succeeded in doing, to my view, to my way of thinking, is sufficiently rooting the concept in a deeper understanding of local economic development. So it tends to be a rather free-floating concept that we bring in when we want to sort of talk about the impact of shocks or whatever. But really, it needs to be integrated with our understanding of local economic development. That's the first point I want to make. That really then is a conceptual issue. It's both definitional, but it's how you conceptualize the notion. Because, rightly pointed out, there are at least three definitions: restorative bounce back, absorptive capacity, and then much more adaptive resilience. But what I mean in terms of the local economy is not entirely straightforward, and different economic theories will interpret resilience in different ways. And I have to say here that resilience is not a term that economists have tended to use. They analyze shocks, but don't use the terminology of resilience. So there is a bit of a challenge there, and this is what I've been trying to do the last 3 or 4 years, working on this amongst other things, is to try and root it within some sort of economic framework. So it's a conceptual problem. In other words, what do we mean by it when apply it to a local economic context. Then I think following on from that, the very issue which I'd be very interested in hearing other people's view on, and it's not straightforward in my opinion, is that speaking, resilience refers to the ability of a system, in our case a local economy or a city, to respond to a shock. So that begs the question of what is shock? Now, she's using something which is fairly sudden, perhaps unexpected, it's disruptive, and we could probably agree on examples of that: the shutdown of a major steelworks in a town or city, or a coal mine, or the uprooting of a local plant which has been bought out by another, and it's actually was a dominant employer. It closes down. That has a shock through the local system. So it's quite sudden and unexpected. Now, the problem is that recently people have begun to use the concept of wider context, really, of slow burn processes, by which I think they mean ongoing cumulative change. Now, climate change would be the archetypical example. If we believe it's happening, and I do, it's something which is progressively getting more intense and accumulating. That's a slow burn process. It's an unfortunate terminology there, but it's a slow burn process. Another might be, for example, a group of local firms are aware that there's a foreign competitor or competitors that are increasingly over time capturing their market share. But it's an ongoing slow process. Now, much depends on how, in this latter case, the firms react. If they act by not doing very much, then they'll progressively lose competitiveness. There'll come a point where their profitability disappears and they will shut down. So it's an interesting issue here between the relationship between a slow burn process and a shock. So that's another question which I think we need to discuss. I think a question of scale. What the resilience of a local economy? It's resilience for whom? One might imagine that firms have lost competitiveness from overseas competition or whatever. So one way of them re-rating themselves is to perhaps shed labour, save capital for labour, emerge more profitable. For them, they've been quite resilient. But in the local labour market, they've shed workers. The workers have got to find other jobs in the local community, which they may or may not be able to do. So the question of resilience for whom? Me raises distributional issues. Don't impact across the whole of the local economy and society equally. So parts of the local economy are more resilient than others, and what are the distributional consequences of that? So that's another key which I think we've not explored yet sufficiently. And I think Karen's right. I think case study work is called for here. It's a little bit more difficult to get insight into that sort of issue using large-scale statistical work. So I think case study work could be extremely useful there. I think Karen's other point about time is really important, because thinking back to an example I talked about in one of the papers I wrote about the closure of hundreds of coal mines in the UK, 1980s and 1990s. And most communities were heavily reliant on the coal industry, so it really was a major shock when the mines were closed. Now, some recovered quite quickly, a matter of 3 or 4 years, in mechanisms of labour market adjustment. 20 years on, in fact, even now 30 years on, have still not recovered in terms of going back to what was their level of employment and so forth. Karen's right. There's a real issue here about the time period over which you measure, define, or expect resilience to have occurred. If you wait, then hopefully a community will recover. I'm thinking of New Orleans and Hurricane Katrina. It may take 30, 40 years, I don't know, for all communities in the New Orleans to recover. Certain parts have recovered already, other parts certainly not. So there's again a question of what period are we bringing resilience over, and over which time expected to have occurred. So there are questions here of how we differentiate or link the notions of some form of bounce back or adaptation, restructuring, persistence, and a term that economists do use, amongst others, hysteresis, where you get a lot shadow effect, possibly, of the shock itself, a night of remnants, which is this idea of being memory, from the shock. So there are a series of terms here. They're not purely sort of academic terms. They're quite important, I think, which relate to the time period over which we measure shocks and therefore resilience. But the basic point I want to make, and this refers to this diagram, hopefully you got on the screen, entirely with Karen, because I think Karen was making this point really, that resilience is not a sort of state airs. It's an ongoing process. It's made by the process of economic development itself. So an economy which is diverse and dynamic and built over time is generating and reproducing a high degree of resilience when a shock comes along. An economy which is sort of very centered on just one industry, there's not an awful lot of diversification going on, can in a sense really develop a lack of resilience over time, so that when a shock does occur, it's very vulnerable. It finds it very difficult to restructure and recover. So the diagram, I think, was one that a colleague and I tried to demonstrate that resilience is a process intimately related to the process of economic development. Economic development pathways shape a region or locality's resilience. Resilience feeds back, particularly if there's restructuring and adaptation going on, the resilience feeds back to change the development pathways. So it's an ongoing recursive process. And the bottom part of that diagram, very simply, relates back to what Karen was saying, that you've got a series of factors and conditions, many of which may be locally specific, others may arrive at a higher spatial scale, a regional or national or even international scale, that determine how well a local economy, how vulnerable it is, how it reacts to shocks, how it adjusts and adapts, and then it comes out of this process on a new developmental pathway. And it's a very sort of simple list there of things. Now, there's another diagram which I think I sent through, a slide. Again, a sort of elaboration in some ways of what Karen was talking about.
You relied with the industrial and business structure, financial arrangements, governance and arrangements. Yes, yeah, very good. I have it on the screen.
Yeah. Again, that's not meant to be complete, but it's really the purpose of that is to show that really got a very complex set of factors that can influence the vulnerability of an area to shocks and disruptions, the way it reacts and adjusts, and the capacity for changing some of its structures, its modes of governance, in response to the shock. And so the challenge for policymakers, I think, really, is to both, on the one hand, locate their locality, if you can put it this way, their local economy within a wider context of factors and conditions that affects their resilience, but at the time to be aware of the diversity of things that in a local context that affects that resilience and therefore provides possibly some which one can devise policies to improve resilience over time.
Thank you very much for this, because it's true that it shows that there are many factors that are influencing, but you also say that basically there could be a value for local policymakers to actually locate themselves within this context and try to benchmark themselves or better understand where they stand on these various factors.
It had a message for policymakers, and I've talked to quite a few recently, because I'm doing a big project on the economic evolution of cities for the British government. I think really the key thing about local economies and city economies for policymakers, and it's far from easy, and I don't have a template or a blueprint for this, but policymakers to try and devise strategies and get locals and networks and government arrangements such that they assist the adaptability of their economy. One does what shocks around the corner. The ability to actually make an economy adaptive that I think is important. And that might be the best way of looking at resilience, is to try and improve the adaptability of local economy so that when shocks do come along, so vulnerable or even if they are hit, they can recover and regenerate. So that, I think, is the way of looking at it.
Yeah, thank you very much, Ron. This is precisely what we want to explore, the link between resilience and adaptability, and how do you make this work in practice? That's another challenge. But perhaps we can hear now from Neil, because he has been actually using this resilience and resilience framework to advise at local level on this precise aspect. So perhaps, Neil, you want to react?
Sure. Thanks very much. Thank you, Karen and Ron, and hello from a grey Manchester. I'm happy listening here. That was fascinating from both contributors. So thanks very much. I agree. I think resilience is part of a process of local economic development, and we would think that it's part of a progressive local economic development agenda. I think we need to understand the term is contested. I completely agree. I think it's a fuzzy concept. I think it's conceptually fraught. But we have done with it for the last 10 years or so is to try to use it in practical policy ways. How can we experiment with this term, accept ideas that surround it, and particularly around advancing local economic strategies which are progressive, that's socially progressive, and environmentally progressive too. I think that resilience helps in that way of trying to think more positively about local economics, particularly in relation to wider place. And starting point, which I think is just useful to think about the starting point where I came into this, or my organisation came into this, is that we meet frequently with makers, directors of economic development, local leaders of councils, and I just recall one particular conversation I had in a part of post-industrial Scotland, and this had suffered from all the malaise one would expect, and there's been 30 years in recession. It was probably around 2006, and this person said to me, we don't have enough tools in our toolbox to deal with problems here, or at least the tools in the prevailing economic development toolbox. He said, we've tried inward investment, it works a bit, but we don't seem to get the inward investment that other areas get. We've tried the physical regeneration, and it helps a bit. The place looks better, but still, sometimes the problems remain. It's difficult to dislodge. We've tried all the other things like business incubators, workplaces, but don't seem to have a very entrepreneurial culture. What he was saying is, what else do we need to think about? And he said one particular fruit has always stuck in my mind. We seem to have a poor DNA, economic DNA in this place, in terms of actually being able to deal with the shocks that come along, but also grab the opportunities. Now, that's thinking about this notion of resilience, and it got me thinking to, well, how do we kind of test if this resilience work could help? And this idea, concept could help by locking some of the issues that this fellow in Scotland was speaking to me about. And two questions in my mind, this is around 2007. Can some local economies deal better with negative change? As Ron mentioned, a kind of a large factory closure. How some people seem to places do well with that, but other places not so well. What's the difference between, what's the DNA that means one factory can close in one town, but it's a huge problem, or a factory closes in another town, and there seems some way to get over it quicker? And the question I was pondering was, why are some places capable of grabbing opportunities and are flexible and agile in given economic opportunities than other areas. So, cutting a long story short, we did got some funding, research funding, and we did some quantitative and qualitative study work looking at policy in cities around the world, which tried to understand this variation in capabilities to deal with shocks or grab opportunities.
But you've done some research now. So, can you already share some of the findings with us in terms of what bring this local resilience and in the local areas, in the places?
Surely, I'm cutting a long story short here. What it all boiled down to is that diagram that's kind of on your screen, which is a simple model, and it's kind of for practitioners to understand that there's a range of different facets in a locality and out of the locality that we need to consider in terms of making that place more resilient. The idea is it's a system model, a relationship model, and what we need to think about is policies that relate to those particular elements in that locality. The big thesis goes that if there is decent policies that connect up all those elements, the place has perhaps a greater probability of being more resilient than us. And then we've kind of done a number of studies around those measuring a local economy in relationship to those facets. It's still a work in progress, and I'd like to work with others to kind of explore it, but it seems to me that we have a skeletal form of rebuilding of how we do economic development strategies to actually be progressive into something to make an area more be able to deal with shocks, but also be able to grab opportunities. I don't want to go because I'm conscious of time.
Yeah, that's very nice. Thank you, Neil. Yeah, so perhaps we will take a few questions. We're like often a little bit delayed, so we have not much. We have another 10, 15 minutes for questions. So the question, how do they work? We now it's time to open the floor to all participants, and we invite you to actually write your questions, and as we receive the questions, we will ask our panelists. We'll take a few questions, and then we will ask our panelists to respond. I see that there are already questions, and thank you, Alexander, for sharing them on the screen. So the first question is, where can one draw the line on resilience? I mean, can we say that the region has actually recovered if the changes are such that it's no longer recognizable in terms of population, culture, etc.? Is the measure that it is doing fine economically as a geographical area? So that's one first question. So can one draw the line on resilience? The second question is, are size and market diversity perhaps critical characteristics of resilient areas? Here we're talking about size and market diversity. I think diversity, economic diversity, many of you mentioned this as an important aspect. The last question we have is the example of climate change was mentioned as a slow burn process. In planetary timescale, climate change is actually too fast, so that biodiversity cannot adapt. Is it possible that the resilience of human development and nature contradict each other? Example is a way to bounce back economically is to make massive use of existing natural resources. So here, this last question really for panelists is inviting to reflect on perhaps the time scale. We said time was important, and then what does it mean? And I think it's coming back to what Ron was saying a bit on resilience for whom, for human development or for nature resilience, and are there contradictions? So we have these three questions. Are they clear for all panelists?
The first one is perhaps not quite as clear as it might be. I'm not too sure. But want me to have a quick go at the size and market diversity?
Yes, please.
Yeah. That's interesting because the whole issue of the size of a local economy and the diversity or specialization of its structure, economic structure, are at the moment issue of debate within regional studies. Major debate about whether specialization is more advantageous than diversity, vice versa, and also about size. Because size is argued to give you more scope, more variety, a larger home market effect, so you're not quite perhaps so reliant on exports and so forth. I think the diversity issue is actually quite critical. I think for some examples where cities and regions have been quite specialized, but they're able to branch out into other activities when their basic industry began to decline or was under threat. Pittsburgh in the US, I think, has been quite successful in specializing out of, or diversifying, I should say, out of steel into other activities. Other cities that have specialized don't seem to be able to diversify to the same extent. I think that for me, diversity is, in the long run, essential for positive economic evolution and adaptability of local economies. Because diversity tends to generate, over the long run, perhaps not short run, where specialization may be more important. In the long run, I think diversity and being able to branch into other activities as a safeguard against shocks and also the ability to deal with them is actually very, very important. But that question taps into an enormous debate, bigger debate within the regional studies at the moment about the role of specialization. All one can say is the economic landscape of any one country, and the UK is a classic example of this, is littered with the remains of areas that were once highly specialized and haven't been able to sort of sufficiently reorientate themselves. Specialization in the long run, I don't think is very good for resilience.
But basically, it also means that the places that look like some places are really succeeding well in one economic period, if you like, are not necessarily the ones that are going to be successful later on.
Could well be. Yeah. The other thing, just very quickly, it relates to another area which I have real problems with, and I know is very, very within the European Commission, and that's the idea of smart specialization for communities. And I think that's highly problematic notion, but that is in a way wrapped up with the resilience debate, the resilience concept, I think. So it's a good question. It raises all sorts of issues.
Yeah, okay. Indeed. And so perhaps we'll take another question now. There are more questions coming up, which is great. I'm just reading some of the... So anybody, Neil or Karen, wants to take on the other questions?
I could start on the climate change question. I think
yes,
really,
please.
Really an interesting question. And I think the challenge of China is, raises all these issues, and there's some interesting work on it out recently, not just from China itself, the reports that came out this week, but also the Paulson Institute, which has been looking at sustainable economic development in China. And the challenge of, retooling from this old economy, which is heavy polluting, and it's extremely difficult. Right now, what China's doing to deal with climate change in Beijing is moving the steel plants just outside of the Beijing borders to other places, and their air quality gets worse very quickly. One thing that China is attempting is to start up its wind energy industry, in that it takes a lot of steel to build wind turbines. So it's exactly this issue of using natural resources and continuing the trajectory towards high pollution. And so, it's the challenge with China climate change is going to be to find resilient ways of moving to a green economy that are what people are thinking about now is not how you kind of dismantle China's steel plants and move them to somewhere else, but really how do you work within those, keep the steel industry there, but gradually help its emissions taper.
Yeah, there is a link with another then subsequent question. I think they were talking about some question on economic subsidiarity. However, this can be defined. I mean, if we can scroll down, Alexander, to the later questions, there was one on linked to the notion of economic resilience, and so I don't know what this means, but does it mean that we have to be careful also when we're defining resilience that we're not giving like too much prominence to some aspects, some economic aspect over other aspects? In the ministerial declaration of the OECD, we talked about economies, but we also talked about resilient societies. Is that also, I mean, how do you deal with this?
Well, can I just say quickly about... Yeah, sorry, go ahead. Yep.
Yeah, just to say on that is that I think we need to consider that you have the large dominant city region. I think polycentricity is intrinsically perhaps more resilient. That means many district centres, university space is very important, and the work we did in particular city regions elsewhere in the world, not UK, the largest city regions that have a dominant industrial function are less resilient than ones that have more distributed industrial function. The point I would say is that I think we need to watch when we talk about local economic resilience. We don't just focus on economics. The basis to a great and thriving place includes wider social issues too. In fact, social development is a major factor and an input into economic success and a resilient economy. So I think we do need to think not as narrowly about economics and economic development in its traditional sense. It needs to be extended to think how we think about community and social development as a key player within a resilient local economy. And that's in a sense how our work focuses quite heavily on the social economy as the kind of forgotten leg of the stool regarding how an economy functions, but more important how it can be more resilient.
I think your first point, Neil, was really, really interesting. I think the spatial structure dimension, which we haven't really explored. I think you're right. I mean, the polycentric metropolitan region could be a lot more resilient than a region dominated by one very large city. I think that's a very interesting issue. And it's not really been explored, so I think that's an excellent idea. And I agree entirely about the social dimension as well. The subsidiarity, I just have a quick comment about that, because I think that too raises some intriguing points, because I think there is possibly a danger, and I can understand why local policymakers might make this, I wouldn't say error, but fall into this trap. If you're thinking about local resilience, you tend to focus on the local capacities, local structures, and so forth. Rightly so. But a lot of things that happen at the local level are shaped, determined, and constrained by what happens at a higher spatial scale. Mm-hmm. And I think, in the UK, for example, where we have a real problem of spatial imbalanced economic growth. I think a lot of that, my own personal view, is to do with the concentration of economic, political and financial power in the London area. And the economy gets seen by national policymakers through the lens of London, or has traditionally been so. So that, policies can emanate from the centre, fiscal and monetary and infrastructural policies, which can have quite damaging effects on particular local economies, and really constrain how they can react to them. So resilience is a multi-scalar thing, I think. I think that subsidiarity idea is a very important one, actually.
Let me just continue this discussion, because we have more questions coming up. And so there was one question looking at this concept of resilience being culturally defined. And is this concept culturally defined? For example, do we realize that the difference in understanding concept across countries and regions? Does it mean that we see that there is something culturally defined with resilience? Have some localities or have some countries or regions been more attached to this than other measures of success in the economic sense? Have we looked into this cultural aspect? And the second two questions that I will want to bring, because Ron doesn't see the question written, it's more about again data and also measurement, because there's one about foresight. Is foresight a key practice to adopt in order to build resilient economies? And there's one on big data. Can big data help the resilience field and local economies? So I'm just putting that on the table, saying that because I know Ron doesn't see the question. Sorry.
Thank you.
Can I just talk about that culture point? I think resilience is not culturally defined, but culture has a role to play within resilience, if that makes sense. And I think each individual locality has its own cultural milieu, which lends itself to a particular strength or weakness. And so in that, I visited Haiphong in Vietnam, which is a society, and in there, Haiphong had many weaknesses, we felt, in terms of its work. But what it did have a strength in was the ability of that locality to command large amounts of public capital, harness wealth capital to then spend on big infrastructure projects. So in that sense, it was resilient in terms of being able to do that. But that was part of its political governance context. And also in India has a very impoverished public sector, but it does have a very strong NGO sector who provides much of some of the public services in India. So in a sense, it's weak in one element, or brittle perhaps in one element, but it's actually strong in another. So I think culture and the nature of a particular locality in terms of identity, history, context, does play a role in the extent to which a locality is potentially more resilient or not. But I don't think resilience as a concept is culturally defined. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. I just mentioned some work we've just started here in with some colleagues in the Netherlands. We've got a huge data set on the behavioural traits of individuals. It's about, I think, over 1.6 million sample size. It's huge. And we mapped this up for the UK, and they've got psychologists have these 5 basic dimensions of behavioural traits, do various things with them. And what's amazing is that how these traits vary dramatically across the country, across the UK. So to some extent, behavioural traits have to do with a culture, local culture, and therefore they may condition how people respond to change, but much more positive and outward-going and extrovert, and to use some of the psychological or not. It's very interesting. So we're going to pursue that and investigate that. Can I just say something about foresight? I think that's a very interesting question, because part of the work that I'm involved with the UK Government Office for Science on a foresight program, The Future of Cities it's called, is precisely to engage in scenario work. What would cities of 30, 40 years look if such? The question of, a zero oil society or something of this. You can have these extremes, and they are extremes, of course, but you can begin to sort of think about and follow through as a thought experiment, a thought process. What cities, what would they, what sort of structural and spatial reorganization, what the social structures would be like, under various sort of rather extreme, but some of them possible and others, scenarios for 30. We're doing them for 25 and 40 years hence. It's highly speculative, but I think it's actually quite it can be an insightful way of going about this, in terms of particularly you think things like sustainability, and so foresight work I think is an interesting dimension that perhaps resilience who's studying resilience could well follow through.
Yeah. Karen, you want to react to any of the questions also?
Yeah, I'm still stuck on the issue of culture. I actually do see it, the notion of resilience is culturally defined. I think I've seen in different regions really different definitions of resilience, and I'm thinking here, for instance, of the rural Andes. A peasant village in the Andes might see resilience. For instance, I've seen some work on climate change and trying to, build reservoirs and capture water in the Andes, so adapting to climate change, whereas a contrast would be the rural south of the United States, where resilience is, let's go back to the good old days of the white boy network and, manufacturing jobs. So we have very, very different definitions of what resilience would look like in their places.
That's important.
Some, I guess, resilience might be, staying with the status quo, might change.
Right.
Yeah.
That's right.
Okay. I think, unfortunately, we haven't had time to pick on all questions, but we've started a good discussion already. We'll keep the questions that we have not answered for tomorrow. I hope the people who asked questions can stay with us. I see that we would like to continue discussing on this topic, and I just would like to remind everybody that the second webinar will take place tomorrow at 5 p.m. Central European time, so that's 1 hour later than this one. And just perhaps to share my screen one last time to just explain what are the next steps for those of you who are not gonna come back tomorrow. One second. Here. Just I wanted to let you know that there will be today and tomorrow are the webinars dedicated to understanding resilience and measuring it. So tomorrow we'll focus a little bit more on local labor market and on measurement. There will be 2 resilience in practice webinars in January, and we'll keep you posted on this. I think one will be focused on aging societies, the other one will be focused on the transition to a green economy, and we have one last webinar in February, beginning of February, but we wanted to give you a chance as the participants to make suggestions for topic. I mean, we heard the refugee example. Is that something we could look into? We also see that technological change has been mentioned. So we want to give you a chance to make suggestions on this, and we'll get back to you via email, and you will have the opportunity to tell us more. Also, to warn you that, as I mentioned, that this work will be very much based on local case studies, and we will launch a call for case studies, and you'll be aware, you'll be informed about this. Really, we want to hear about your stories, all local stories of resilience, so perhaps a way to explore what culturally is understood by resilience. This is very good. And finally, as I said earlier, this is our first webinar, so we would really welcome your suggestions to improve this, and we'll get back to you with opportunities to tell us what you thought about this webinar. It has been short and intense. I want to thank all our panelists today for joining, and I want to thank also the Simpraxis team for hosting us technically, and Angela, my colleague that you have been in touch with, who has been helping with the preparation of all this. And I hope to hear everybody tomorrow, and to hear about your questions tomorrow. Thank you very much for taking part in this webinar.
Thank you. Much. Thanks, Karen.
Thank you.
Appreciate that.
Bye.
Bye now. Bye-bye.
Thank you all.